His name equaled fear. Preacher equaled death.
He was in charge of a group of members who were known as the janitors. The janitors were the people that had to clean up, and you couldn't be a janitor unless you killed somebody.
Then there was Clarence Preacher Heatley.
Right.
AKA the Black Hand of Death.
Right.
Not only did he kill people, but he would torture them.
Right.
Then they just dismember the bodies.
Back in the day, New York was run by some truly dangerous and ruthless people. But there was one man who ruled them all, Clarence Preacher Heatley. Responsible for 45 murders, he was a psychotic killer who decided life or death with just the flick of his thumb.
What they would do is he would vote thumbs up or thumbs down like the Roman gladiator days, and he was the ruler. He would just go like this with the thumb, and that meant kill him.
He was so evil that his crew even had janitors, whose only job was to clean up the mess after victims were tortured and killed. His team wasn't just a gang, they were serial killers pretending to be gangsters. Known as the Black Hand of Death, Preacher struck fear into anyone and everyone. Let's get into it. Clarence Heatley was born in Harlem in the early 1950s. And while not much is known about his childhood, by the time he hit his 20s, his life was already on a dark path. He spent much of those years in and out of jail for different crimes, everything from larceny to robbery. But what really stood out about him, even back then, was his sheer presence. Heatley was a giant of a man, standing at 6'7" and weighing over 260 pounds. His size alone was intimidating, but that wasn't even the scariest thing about him. But this massive frame made it easy for him to scare people. If Preacher wanted something from you, he had a bad habit of just taking it. But he didn't only rely on brute strength. What made him even more dangerous was his charisma. He had this unique gift with words, a smooth way of talking that could convince people to do whatever he wanted, all while smiling in their face. This talent for persuasion earned him the nickname Preacher. When Heatley spoke, people listened, so with that combination of brute force and slick manipulation, Preacher always got what he wanted.
Preacher had been kicking around the streets of Harlem since the early 70s, and everybody knew him by his nickname, the Black Hand of Death.
He had 99.9% of Harlem under pressure.
And he didn't discriminate when choosing his targets. If he saw a drug dealer cruising around in a nice car, Preacher would take it. If he walked into a corner store and wanted the cash in the register, he'd hop the counter and empty it out. He even forced landlords to hand over entire apartments. If a unit opened up in a building and Preacher decided he wanted it, he'd tell the owner he was moving in. Nobody dared say no. That's how much fear he carried. People knew when they saw Preacher's iconic black Mercedes rolling down the block, they'd better pray it just kept driving.
The drug dealer looked like he was getting paid, so to say. He was driving a brand new full-size Mercedes-Benz, and Preacher liked that car. That was Preacher's.
But the true reign of terror didn't officially start until 1983. That's when the infamous Preacher Crew was born. The crew would go on to become one of the most violent and feared criminal organizations New York has ever seen. At its peak, the crew had somewhere between 25 and 50 members, including Preacher's own son and daughter. And while the crew carried his name, it was Preacher himself who was the unquestioned leader. He ruled it like a dictator, laying down strict rules that no one dared break.
Father trained us just like the feds did. Watch, we took pictures of them.
Members couldn't get high on the drugs they sold. They couldn't steal from each other. Internal fighting wasn't tolerated at all. And the biggest rule was to never, ever work with the police. If you broke the rules or were suspected of snitching, the punishment was severe. Some got brutally beaten, others were killed outright. Preacher's second in command was a man named John Cuff, also known as Jack Frost. He was a rogue cop turned gangster. Between 1982 and 1986, Cuff worked as a New York City Housing Authority police officer, while simultaneously running with the Preacher Crew. He didn't just shield the crew from law enforcement, he was knee-deep in the crimes himself, riding along with members to rob rival drug dealers.
John Cuff was an ex-New York City housing cop. As a cop, he provided protection and bodyguard work for Preacher.
Then came one of the darkest parts of the crew, the janitors. Their job was to clean up the mess after the preacher crew tortured and killed their victims. But to understand why they even needed janitors, you have to know just how gruesome and sick the crew really was. They operated a full-blown torture dungeon in the Bronx, in a basement at 275 Grand Concourse. This place became known as a house of horrors. Rival drug dealers and even family members of rivals were dragged there, forced to sit through mock trials. The crew would literally vote on their fate, Roman gladiator style, thumbs up or thumbs down. A thumbs down meant death, and not just death, but death in the most brutal ways imaginable.
There's a building called 2075 Grand Concourse, and there's a basement there. A preacher lived there. The rumor was that he owned the building, and that's where they conducted most of their tortures, their murders.
What they would do is he would vote thumbs up or thumbs down like the Roman gladiator days, and he was the ruler. He would just go like this with the thumb, and that meant kill him.
The violence was systematic and beyond comprehension. Victims were mutilated, limbs chopped off, bodies dismembered, even beheadings. One story, confirmed by multiple crew members, describes how they severed a victim's head and then played soccer with it on the roof of their building.
Jack and my co-defendant Pop was playing soccer with this head on the roof. They was kicking around while I was wrapped up in the plastic bag. These bugged out.
Other times, they used post-mortem SA as a punishment, not for gratification, but purely to dominate and humiliate. It was all about control, power, and instilling fear. These acts mirrored the behavior of pathological serial killers like Jeffrey Dahmer. But the difference was, this wasn't one man. It was an entire crew carrying out this level of depravity. The FBI would later investigate that basement torture chamber. Even though the crew had spent years scrubbing the place down with acid, when forensic teams came in with blacklight technology, the walls still lit up, covered in blood. That chilling discovery showed just how many lives had been taken and how horrifying the scale of their crimes really was. So when you look at the level of carnage Preacher and his people unleashed, you start to understand why the janitors weren't just some extra role. They were a necessity. The janitors were a special unit inside the Preacher crew whose only job was to clean up the mess after victims were tortured and killed. And you couldn't just become a janitor. It wasn't for rookies or guys trying to earn stripes. To qualify, you already had to have killed somebody, and it was considered an honor, a prestigious job inside the crew, almost like a badge of status. They even wore a tattoo that sent chills through the streets, a mop with a bucket of blood inked on the shoulder. That's how twisted it was, and the man who ran this gruesome unit was Anthony Malik Boatwright. He was ex-military and was described as one of the most sadistic, psychopathic members of the Preacher crew. Malik killed not just because he had to, but because he enjoyed it.
This dude Malik was really fucked up mentally, you know what I'm saying? As far as that killing, he loved that. You know what I'm saying? He loved doing it. And he didn't have no picks.
And that's the thing. Preacher's name carried so much weight, it was almost like a death sentence just to hear it. In New York during that time, Preacher's name meant two things: fear and death. His reputation was so terrifying that entire neighborhoods in Harlem and the South Bronx were paralyzed with silence. Nobody talked. Nobody snitched. If you even whispered something about the Preacher crew to the police, you might as well start planning your own funeral.
The police know they just cannot make a case. There's nobody in Harlem, nobody in the South Bronx who's willing to talk, because if you go and say it's a snitch, tell us something about the Preacher crew, you're gonna be dead.
Preacher's name even crossed over into hip-hop culture. For example, 50 Cent once dropped a line in his song Problem Child where he said, "Oh, you the black hand of death. Then why your name ain't Preacher?" That wasn't just a slick bar. That was 50 basically saying, if you're calling yourself the Black Hand of Death, the ultimate benchmark for that kind of reputation is Clarence Preacher Heatley. That's how deep his legend ran. But what really makes Preacher's story insane is the way he struck fear, not just in regular people, but in other gangsters, guys who were already seen as monsters in their own right. Take Alpo Martinez and Rich Porter, two of the biggest names in Harlem's drug scene during the crack era. Rich Porter was larger than life, driving luxury cars, never wearing the same outfit twice, pulling in millions before he even hit 25. Alpo, on the other hand, was a stone-cold killer, feared across the city for being willing to body even his own friends if business required it. These were men who commanded fear and respect everywhere they went, but when it came to Preacher, they fell in line. Alpo himself was forced to operate under Preacher's shadow, even paying tribute just to move around Harlem safely. That's how real it was. There's even an infamous story told by Roger Bonds, a guy who was hustling on the same block as Preacher. The police mistakenly raided Preacher's spot because of noise coming from Bonds' operation. When Preacher found out, he blamed Bonds for the inconvenience and demanded payment. And this whole thing went down right in front of Rich Porter and Alpo, but they just stood there and didn't say a word.
Preacher looked at me and Preacher said, "Yo, what's up? You owe me some money." I said, "Yo, what I owe you for?" He said, "Oh, you know when the police came, they ran up in my spot instead of your spot. Y'all was out there making all that noise, blah, 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 blah." I'm standing there, Rich Porter standing there, Alpo standing there.
Rich Porter, the same guy who prided himself on never backing down, told his crew to shut it down whenever Preacher was in the area. He knew Preacher wasn't someone you tested, he was someone you paid. Preacher had revolutionized extortion. He'd simply pull up, make his demand, and collect. There was no negotiation, no back and forth. Everyone knew the deal: pay Preacher or die painfully. And it wasn't just Harlem. Even the legendary Supreme Team out of Queens, one of the most organized mob-like drug organizations in New York history, ran into Preacher's shadow. The Supreme Team was no joke. They controlled entire territories with strategy and violence, operating almost like a corporate machine. Gerald Prince Miller, their main enforcer, was known for being one of the most feared figures in the game. Prince thrived off intimidation. His whole persona was built on being the guy nobody wanted to cross. But all of that street credibility meant nothing when he crossed paths with Preacher. Brian Glaze Gibbs, an eyewitness, told a story about Prince and Preacher being locked up in the same federal facility. Prince tried to pull the same intimidation tactics on Preacher that worked on everyone else. He demanded to see Preacher's paperwork, tried to punk him, basically attempting to force Preacher to check in like he was some type of snitch.
And you coming up on them with a group, telling them, "Hey, show me your paperwork." Or if you got a rat or snitch label, you got to check in. You did that to Preacher, of all person. Sit back and think about it. Prince, what? You 5'10", with a $180, 200 max, and you approaching Preacher about 6'6".
But Prince was about 5'10", maybe 200 pounds. Preacher was a 6'7", 300-pound giant who had been terrorizing New York since before Prince was even on the scene. The size difference alone was crazy, but more than that, Preacher wasn't just another street guy. He was in a different league altogether, so when Prince tried to press him, it backfired. The intimidation game failed completely.
You try to force him off. Talk about, you got to check in. How did that go? That didn't go too well. Because once again, Preacher's not your average individual.
Word spread through the prison like wildfire. The legendary Supreme Team enforcer had just been punked by one man. Preacher didn't need a crew, didn't need territory, didn't need soldiers. His reputation for violence was enough. And that moment was symbolic. It crushed the image of the Supreme Team's dominance. It proved that no matter how big your operation was, no matter how many people feared your name, there was still one man who could erase all of that in an instant. Now, Preacher and his crew weren't just violent killers. They were into every kind of hustle you can imagine. They tracked drugs heavy through the Bronx and Harlem. They extorted dealers and made them pay taxes that ran into tens of thousands of dollars every single month. And they even took on contract hits for people who wanted rivals out the way. Word about their reputation spread so far that other drug dealers would literally approach Preacher and pay him big money to handle their problems. That's how feared he was. But if there's one thing the Preacher crew was especially notorious for, it was they turned into a business model. Rivals, their families, even people who just looked like they might be worth money. Preacher's crew would snatch them up and demand ransoms. But out of all things they pulled off, two cases stand out the most. One was the alleged of R&B superstar Bobby Brown, and the other was of 12-year-old Donnell Porter, the younger brother of Rich Porter. Both of these stories shook New York in very different ways. Let's start with Donnell Porter. On December 5th, 1989, Donnell was just a kid walking home from school when he was grabbed 4 blocks from his house. What makes this story even darker is who set it up. It wasn't a rival. It wasn't some outsider. It was his own uncle, Johnny Apple Porter. Apple was active in the streets and had a rep as a guy with no morals, no code. When he saw how much money his nephew Rich was making, he saw an opportunity. He went to Preacher with the idea, let's my own nephew. We can get $500,000 for him.
Apple was the one who brought that situation to my pops, right? And told him that it was easy for him to get the nephew because the nephew goes to school, you know what I'm saying, in the morning, such and such time.
Now here's the twist. Preacher didn't even like the idea at first. According to Ozzie Faison, who knew all the players back then, Preacher thought Apple was disgusting for even suggesting such a thing. He didn't respect a man who'd target his own blood. But Preacher was still about money, and money talked. So, even though he didn't co-sign it, he gave Apple the green light. That night, Apple and Malik snatched Donnell.
But when he learned about it, you feel me, he was kind of upset. This is what I hear with them, but you know, they had to play it out because it was already involved.
When Donnell didn't come home, his family panicked. That evening, the calls started coming in. On the other end of the line, a voice told the family they had Donnell and wanted $500,000 to let him go. The family tried to explain they didn't have that kind of money. Truth was, Rich Porter himself only had about half of what they were demanding. The kid hung up, leaving the family to spend a sleepless night not knowing if Donnell was alive or dead. The next day, the crew called back, lowering the demand to $350,000. But to drive the message home, they staged one of the most horrifying acts of psychological terror Harlem had ever seen. They cut off Donnell's index finger. They stuffed it in a coffee can, along with his rings and a cassette tape recording of his trembling voice, begging for help. They left the can in a McDonald's bathroom for the family to pick up. On the tape, Donnell could be heard crying, saying, "They cutted my finger off. Please help me get the money. I love you, Mommy." It was heartbreaking, and to think it was his uncle that was the mastermind behind it all made this case feel especially sickening.
And they wanted how much? Like $500,000 or something?
Yeah, that's what it was stated to that band.
And then to show that they were serious, they actually cut off his little brother's
The very
finger.
next day, but they left it in a McDonald's on Broadway in 125th Street and called his house and said there's something to go look, and he sent somebody over there, and that's what they came back with.
The family scrambled and told the crew they could only come up with about $200,000. Preacher himself was actually willing to accept that, but Apple wasn't having it. He kept insisting they could squeeze more money out of the Porters. Preacher went along with him, and that decision turned out to be fatal.
My father was willing to take that, right? But Apple and Malik himself was like, nah, we can still get more. We can still get more from him. So my pops was like, all right, he settled for that.
Then, as if the situation wasn't tragic enough, Rich Porter was murdered by his own associate, Alpo Martinez, on January 3rd, 1990, over a drug money dispute. Overnight, the Porter family's world collapsed. They had one son murdered and another still being held hostage. And for the Rich's death was a game changer. With Rich gone, there was nobody left who could pay them. They also knew they couldn't just let Donnell go, because at that point, he could identify them.
So by the time that happened, it was definitely no money. You know what I'm saying? My pops knew that there wasn't no money. And I believe that was one of the reasons why he said let the kid go. Apple told my father nah and nah because he seen our face and everything.
3 weeks later, the nightmare ended in the worst way possible. A homeless man searching for cans found Donnell's body stuffed in 14 garbage bags, dumped less than a mile from where his brother Rich's body had been discovered weeks earlier. The streets of Harlem were stunned. The whole city was shaken. This wasn't just crime anymore. This was evil that broke all codes. But it didn't stop there. Preacher's reach extended far beyond Harlem, even into the world of celebrities. That's where the alleged Bobby Brown kid comes in.
I saw something in there where it was saying that the Preacher crew actually Bobby Brown.
Yeah.
Is this true?
Yeah.
It was 1993. Bobby was married to Whitney Houston and was at the peak of fame. The story goes, Bobby owed a New Jersey dealer $25,000 for. Preacher caught wind of it and saw opportunity. He bought that debt for $10,000, basically telling Bobby, "You don't owe him anymore, you owe me now." But Preacher wasn't looking for 25 grand. He wanted way more. They set up Bobby using a woman as bait, a Harlem vixen who lured him out of the New Yorker nightclub. Once outside, he was grabbed and thrown into a van. They took him to a vacant Bronx apartment, stripped him naked, hog-tied him, and shoved a rag in his mouth. Then came the torture. Malik allegedly grabbed Bobby by his genitals and even burned the hairs off his the lighter when Bobby refused to sing for them. They kicked him, put guns to his head, and threatened to kill Whitney if she didn't pay. This time, the ransom wasn't 25 grand, it was $400,000.
Took Bobby into one of the apartments, and Malik stripped him and hogtied him. And he's like, "Sing the song." I don't want to sing. He said, "No, sing the song." He kicked him on the floor, grabbed his by his and started burning the hair on his nuts.
And despite Bobby being one of the most famous entertainers in the world at the time, Whitney Houston was told she couldn't call the cops. According to eyewitness David "Popcorn" Collins, Whitney showed up in disguise, oversized glasses, wig, a cab ride all by herself, carrying a bag full of cash, $400,000 to get Bobby back. Popcorn would later say Whitney earned respect that night. She came across as fearless, strong, and willing to do anything to protect her family. The crew even admitted they looked at her differently after that, like she was gangsta in her own right.
And she came to the Bronx by herself in a cab with a big glasses and a wig with $400,000 in the bag to come get that. She walked up into the apartment, money on the floor, and said, "Where is Bobby?" And here it is, you got gangsters sitting there with guns in their hands.
Bobby has always denied the happened. He insists there was no drug debt, no ransom. Whether you believe it or not, it shows just how far Preacher's influence reached. But like all reigns of terror, Preacher's couldn't last forever. By the mid-1990s, his empire started to crack. Ironically, it was his own paranoia and ruthlessness that sped up his downfall. He started turning on his own men, killing off loyal soldiers the moment he thought they were becoming a liability. At that point, the feds had already formed the C-11 Squad, a joint FBI/NYPD task force, specifically designed to go after violent crews that local cops couldn't handle. The big break came in 1994 when one of Preacher's own killers came forward, begging the feds for protection. That shows you how terrifying Preacher really was. This guy knew snitching was basically side, but the fear of Preacher outweighed the fear of prison. The informant dropped bombshells. He told investigators that Preacher himself had ordered Malik's death, his most loyal soldier. Preacher and his number two, John Cuff, had decided Malik was too unpredictable. So in March 1994, they lured him to the infamous Bronx basement, told him they were testing a new gun. When Malik bent down to turn up a radio, Cuff shot him in the back of the head multiple times. What followed was pure horror. They dismembered Malik's body with a circular saw, poured acid on his arms to erase his tattoos. His head was severed and, according to reports, kept in a refrigerator for weeks. Some say it was even paraded around on a stick to terrify other crew members into staying in line. That's how deep Preacher's paranoia ran. He killed his most devoted soldier in the most brutal way possible, just to keep control. And that was the final straw for some members. They started running to the feds. Finally, on July 15, 1996, Clarence Preacher Heatley was arrested. After years of terrorizing Harlem, after dozens of bodies, after running one of the most feared crews New York had ever seen, he didn't go out in a blaze of glory. Despite having soldiers and a reputation for never backing down, he surrendered without a fight. Then came the ultimate twist of irony. The man who made everyone live by the no snitching code flipped instantly when faced with the death penalty. In February 1999, he cut a deal. He pled guilty to racketeering and murder conspiracy tied to 13 drug-related homicides, and in exchange, he saved his own life. The so-called Black Hand of Death became an informant. He even turned on his own son and daughter, who were part of the operation. He gave up everyone. John Cuff and other top members went down too. The Preacher crew was dismantled, and Preacher himself was sentenced to life in prison plus 225 years.